There is a specific kind of laughter that follows a man out of a room. Not the laughter of people who have found something funny. The other kind. The laughter that is not about humor at all but about hierarchy. About a group of people in a room reminding each other of where they stand and where someone else stands, using sound as the instrument of the reminder. The laughter that says, "We have looked at this person and we have decided what he is, and what he is does not belong here." It is the laughter of people who believe they have correctly identified someone who does not belong. Who look at a person and see not what they are capable of but what they currently appear to be. Who mistake a man's circumstances for his character, his present position for his permanent position, his application for proof of his limits rather than evidence of his ambition. The people who laugh that laugh are almost always wrong. And the most complete reckoning is never the one that arrives loudly. It is not the confrontation or the speech or the moment of public reversal that people imagine when they think about justice. It is the one that arrives quietly, over years, through the patient accumulation of something real. The one the people who laughed do not see coming because they stopped watching long ago, having decided there was nothing worth watching. The moment they stopped watching was the moment the building began. This is the story of Kofi. And this is the story of what happens when a man walks out of a room where people are laughing at him and decides, in that exact moment, that the laughter is not the end of the conversation. That the conversation has not, in fact, finished. That he will be the one to decide when it is finished. And that when he decides that, he will not do it with noise. Stay with me, because what he built in the 8 years that followed is the kind of thing that makes the people who laughed go very, very quiet. Kofi Mensah was 27 years old when he applied to Hartfield and Associates. He was the second of 4 children, raised in a household that was not wealthy but was serious. A household where the adults understood that education was not a privilege to be appreciated but a responsibility to be discharged, where dinner table conversations were likely to include questions about what you had learned that day and what you were going to do with it, where the expectation was not that you would survive but that you would contribute. His father, Emmanuel Mensah, had worked for 31 years as an administrator in a government ministry, diligent, respected, modest in his achievements and deeply proud of his children's capacity for larger ones. His mother, Grace, had been a secondary school mathematics teacher for the same 3 decades, and had the particular quality of teachers who love their subject. The ability to see the mathematical structure in everything, to find the pattern underneath the surface of things. Kofi had inherited from his mother the capacity to see patterns. From his father he had inherited something perhaps more useful, the patience to wait for the pattern to become clear before acting on it. He had been a careful student. Not the kind who was immediately noticed. He was not flashy, not the boy who raised his hand first or performed his intelligence for approval. He was the kind who read the assignment twice before starting, who made notes on the notes, who arrived at the right answer by a route that was often longer than the shortest available one because the longer route was the one that let him understand the terrain rather than just reach the destination. His professors remembered him not as brilliant but as precise, which is, in the long run, the more useful of the 2 qualities. He had graduated with a degree in finance and joined the industry at the bottom, as everyone does, in a position at a small advisory firm called Crane & Partners. 3 years of honest work, unglamorous, the kind of position that builds knowledge without building reputation, the kind that teaches you how the industry actually operates rather than how it presents itself to the world. He had learned a great deal at Crane & Partners. He had learned about client relationships and about the specific texture of financial analysis when it is done carefully. He had also learned, gradually and with the measured frustration of someone who respects a place and recognizes its limits, that he had taken everything Crane & Partners had to offer and that the next chapter required a different room. He had his degree in finance from a reputable university. He had 3 years of solid, documented, verifiable experience. He had a mind that was organized and precise and capable of the particular kind of patience that financial analysis requires at the highest levels. And he had the specific ambition of someone who has looked carefully at where he is and where he wants to be and has drawn a clear, methodical line between the 2 points. Not in a rush, not impatient with the line's length, simply committed to walking it. Hartfield and Associates was one of the most established financial advisory firms in the city. It had been founded 40 years earlier by a man named Gerald Hartfield, a self-made financier who had built the firm from 1 room and 2 clients into something substantial, who had the specific quality of founders who build things that outlast their active involvement, and who was now largely ceremonial, present at significant events, consulted on matters of history and reputation, removed from the operational reality of a business that had evolved significantly since he had run it. The operational reality of Hartfield and Associates was managed day-to-day by its managing partner, Douglas Osei. Douglas Osei was 51 years old. He had joined Hartfield 22 years earlier as a mid-career hire, risen through the firm with the consistent momentum of someone who understood how institutions work and how to navigate them, and had become managing partner 11 years ago when the previous managing partner retired. He was a man of considerable surface authority, the kind that comes not from any single quality but from the accumulated weight of 22 years of being taken seriously in a particular world. He dressed well. He spoke with the careful cadences of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the quality of your language was considered a signal of the quality of your thinking. He had a face that communicated confidence and a bearing that communicated that the confidence was well-founded. He had also, over 22 years at the center of the same institution, developed a specific and consequential blind spot. He had stopped being able to tell the difference between people who were genuinely capable and people who looked at a glance as though they might be. He had been in rooms with impressive people for long enough that he had unconsciously begun to mistake the signals of impressiveness for impressiveness itself. A certain kind of suit, a certain kind of address on a CV, a certain kind of firm. These things, in Douglas Osei's mental model of the world, had become proxies for quality shortcuts that felt like judgment but were actually something closer to prejudice. The firm occupied the upper 4 floors of a glass building in the commercial district. The reception area on the ground floor was all marble and dark wood, and the specific visual language of institutions that have been in the same place long enough to assume they will always be there. The receptionist was a young woman named Pearl who had been doing this job long enough to know, within approximately 30 seconds of someone walking through the door, whether they were expected and whether they were considered important. She was good at her job. She was also, on that Tuesday morning in January, the last person at Hartfield and Associates who would treat Kofi Mensah with straightforward professional courtesy. Kofi walked through the door on that Tuesday morning dressed in the best suit he owned, which was good but not expensive, the suit of a man who understood the importance of the occasion and had prepared for it to the limit of his current means. He had his CV in a leather folder. He had prepared for the interview for 2 weeks, researching the firm comprehensively, studying their client base and their published work, preparing answers to every question he could reasonably anticipate, preparing questions of his own that would demonstrate the quality of his thinking rather than just the extent of his preparation. He had rehearsed the conversation he expected to have in the way that careful people rehearse things, not scripting himself but mapping the terrain so that when he arrived he would not be navigating it for the first time. He gave his name to Pearl. She confirmed his appointment. She asked him to take a seat. He sat. He waited. He was not the kind of man who was visibly anxious in professional settings. He had learned early that anxiety and excitement produce similar physiological states and that the difference between them is largely a matter of interpretation, that the same alertness which presents as anxiety in one frame of mind presents as readiness in another. He sat in the marble reception area of Hartfield and Associates and chose, deliberately, to be ready. He had been waiting for 11 minutes when he heard the laughter. It came from behind a partially open door near the reception desk. A conference room, he thought, or a glass-fronted office, visible from the waiting area only as a sliver of light and voices. He could not see the people inside. He could hear them clearly. The door was open enough to carry the sound, but not enough to reveal its source. He heard his name first. His full name, the way it appears on a CV, Kofi Mensah. Said in a tone he recognized immediately, the specific tone of someone reading something aloud for the amusement of others rather than for the purpose of conveying information. The tone that announces, "I am about to make you laugh." There was something in the rhythm of it, the slight theatrical elongation of both syllables of his surname, that made the intention unmistakable. And then the laughter that followed. Not all of them, 2 voices, perhaps 3. Not a crowd. The particular cluster that forms around someone who has the authority to set the tone of a room and has exercised that authority in a direction that those present were comfortable following. He sat very still in the waiting area and listened. He heard fragments. The word small firm, said in a way that communicated that a small firm was a disqualifying circumstance rather than a starting point. The words "not quite what we are looking for," said with the ease of someone making a determination they had made many times before and had never needed to examine. And then the words, and this one landed differently from the others, with a specific weight that he would carry for a long time and eventually put to use. Does he know what kind of place this is? This one was not said with laughter. It was said with the particular curiosity of someone genuinely puzzled by the presumption it implied. Does he know what kind of place this is? As though Hartfield and Associates were a category of institution that should have been self-evidently beyond the reach of an applicant from Crane and Partners, and the application itself was evidence of a failure to understand the natural order of things. The laughter resumed briefly, then the sound of chairs. The office door opened fully and Douglas Osei walked out with a man Kofi did not recognize. A colleague or a client. Someone of sufficient standing to warrant Osei's presence in that room at this time. Both of them were still in the residue of whatever had amused them. Both of them arranging their faces, with the practiced ease of professional people, into something approximating neutrality as they registered that the subject of the conversation was sitting in the reception area with a leather folder in his lap. Douglas Osei looked at Kofi for a moment. Then he looked away slightly, to the side, briefly, the involuntary movement of someone recalibrating, and then back. He said, "Mr. Mensah, we will have to reschedule. Something has come up." He said it pleasantly, with the specific pleasantness of a man who does not need to be unkind because he does not need to be anything, because the person across from him is not in any position to make the experience of this moment matter to anyone who matters. The pleasantness of someone for whom this interaction carries no weight on his side of it. Kofi stood. He was aware, in that moment, of several things simultaneously. He was aware of Pearl at her desk, carefully not looking at him. He was aware of the other man, Osei's companion, who had also arranged his face into neutrality, but whose eyes had the specific quality of someone who has just registered an awkwardness and is managing it by not engaging with it. He was aware of the marble floor and the dark wood and the particular quality of light in this reception area that spoke of permanence and establishment and the assumption that the world was arranged around the preferences of the people who worked here. He was aware of all of this, and he decided in the space of the next breath what he was going to do with it. He said, "Of course." He said it in the precise, level tone of someone who has made a decision and is speaking from inside it rather than from the outside of it. He said it without heat, without visible hurt, without any of the things that the moment might reasonably have produced. He shook Douglas Osei's hand. He thanked Pearl by name. He picked up his leather folder and walked out of the marble reception area and through the glass doors and onto the pavement. He stood there for a moment. The January air was cool. The commercial district moved around him. People walking, vehicles passing, the ordinary momentum of a city going about its business on a Tuesday morning. None of it had any particular relationship to what had just happened inside the building behind him. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked around the corner to a coffee shop he had noticed on the way in. He ordered a cup of tea. He sat at a table by the window. He took the notebook he always carried from his jacket pocket. Not the leather folder, the personal notebook, the one he used for thinking rather than presenting, and he opened it to a clean page. He wrote one sentence at the top of the page. He sat with that sentence for several minutes, reading it, considering it, confirming that it was the right sentence and not a different one. Then he closed the notebook. He drank his tea. He looked at the street outside the window. He did not go back to Hartfield and Associates. Not that day. Not ever on their terms. The sentence, when it eventually mattered, was this: build something they will need to buy. Now let me tell you what Kofi Mensah did after he left that building. Because the story of a man who was laughed out of a room and came back to sign the salaries of the people who laughed is only meaningful if we understand exactly what happened in the 8 years between those two moments. The beginning is the wound. The ending is the reckoning. But the years are the story. The actual, specific, unglamorous, patient, difficult, real years are the story. And they are worth understanding in full. He went back to Crane and Partners that afternoon. He sat at his desk. He worked through the rest of the day with the focused attention of someone who has just been given a very clear picture of what the next chapter of their life requires and is already thinking about how to begin it. He did not tell anyone at Crane and Partners what had happened at Hartfield. He did not tell his family. He did not call a friend and describe the humiliation for the relief of having someone be outraged on his behalf. He had found, over the years, that the conversations we have about the worst moments of our lives tend to fix those moments in place, to give them a permanence they would not otherwise have. That talking about a wound is sometimes the thing that makes it take longer to heal. He filed what had happened in a category of his memory that was not daily access but was not forgotten, the category of things that inform rather than drive. He spent the next 14 months in the most deliberate period of professional development of his life to that point. He read everything. Not the obvious texts, he had already read those, they had been his degree. The less obvious ones. The case studies that had not made it into curricula. The practitioner literature that does not appear in academic databases. The specific history of mid-market African financial markets, which was a topic he had identified as the gap in the existing practice. The space where the knowledge existed and the capital existed but the sophisticated advisory capacity did not, because the firms with the capacity did not have the focus and the firms with the focus did not have the capacity. He also, during those 14 months, changed his job. Not immediately, he was deliberate about this too. He continued to perform his work at Crane and Partners with the same quality he always had, because leaving a position badly is always more costly than the short-term relief of leaving it, and because Crane and Partners had given him 3 years of genuine education and deserved his continued respect. But he had identified where he needed to go next and he was working methodically toward it. He had heard of Meridian Capital through a colleague who had left Crane and Partners 18 months earlier for a role there and had mentioned it briefly as a firm worth knowing about. He had noted it and filed it and returned to it when he was ready. He had done his research. Meridian was smaller than Hartfield, considerably smaller at that time, but it had been built on a model that was specifically designed for the kind of work he wanted to do, and it had been built by a person whose professional philosophy he had studied carefully enough to believe was aligned with his own. He applied in the 14th month. The application process at Meridian was different from what he had experienced at Hartfield. There was no marble reception area. The office was a converted floor in a building that had clearly been something else before. High ceilings, exposed brick, the kind of space that communicates that you are here for what you can do rather than for how the environment looks around you. The person who interviewed him first was a woman named Clara, a senior analyst who asked him questions that were genuinely interested in how he thought rather than in confirming assumptions she had already made. The second interview was with Dr. Adwoa Asante herself. Dr. Asante was 44 years old at the time Kofi met her. She had spent the first 20 years of her professional life watching the financial advisory industry operate in ways she found both inefficient and, more specifically, short-sighted ways that prioritized the appearance of quality over the substance of it, that hired for credential rather than capacity, that promoted based on the management of relationships with senior people rather than on the demonstration of genuine analytical capability. She had written a paper about this, a dense, meticulously argued academic paper that had been widely read in certain circles and had caused mild controversy in others, and she had eventually decided that writing about the problem was less interesting than building the solution. Meridian Capital was the solution. She had built it on a set of principles that were simple to state and difficult to execute. Hire for capacity. Promote for performance. Build the client base on the quality of the work rather than on the reputation of the institution. Focus on the markets that the established firms were underserving, not because they were too difficult, but because the established firms had not developed the specialized knowledge required to serve them well, and had not developed that knowledge because developing it would have required them to change in ways that were inconvenient. She had spent 7 years building Meridian. By the time Kofi joined, the firm had 42 employees, a client base that was growing in exactly the way sustainable client bases grow, through referrals from satisfied clients to people with similar needs, and a reputation in certain specialist circles that was considerably larger than its public profile would have suggested. She interviewed Kofi for 2 hours. She did not ask him about his grades or his university or his previous employer's profile in the industry. She gave him a set of analytical problems and asked him to work through them aloud, which he did systematically, showing his reasoning, flagging his uncertainties, identifying where additional information would change his conclusions. She asked him about the mid-market African capital markets gap he had been developing in his thinking, and he told her everything he had worked out, the structure of the opportunity, the specific capability requirements, the particular knowledge that would need to be built, the clients he believed were underserved and why. She asked, "How long have you been thinking about this?" He said, 18 months seriously. 3 years less seriously. She said, "And why have you not found somewhere to build it already?" He said, "I have been building the capacity to build it." The opportunity has been waiting. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I have been trying to build this practice for 3 years. I did not have the right person to lead it. I think I may now. She offered him the role 2 days later. He accepted. He was 28 years old when he joined Meridian Capital as a senior analyst. He was earning more than he had earned at Crane and Partners, working in a room that was smaller than Hartfield's reception area, for a woman who had understood within the first 20 minutes of meeting him what he was capable of, which was, he understood, the first time in his professional life that had happened with someone who had the authority to do something with the understanding. He did not waste it. The practice grew in the way that things grow when they are built on something real. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Not in a way that produced headlines or attracted the attention of the financial press or generated the kind of buzz that certain firms spend considerable resources manufacturing. It grew through work, through the specific, detailed, repeatable quality of the analysis that Kofi and the team he assembled over the first 2 years produced for every client they served. Through the particular satisfaction that clients feel when they are receiving something that is genuinely useful rather than something that is impressively presented. Through the referrals that satisfied clients make to their peers with similar needs, which is the only form of business development that actually compounds over time. Kofi built the team with the same care Dr. Asante had used to build the firm. He did not hire for credential. He did not hire for the signals. He hired for the specific qualities that the work required: analytical precision, the ability to hold complexity without simplifying it prematurely, the willingness to say clearly what you did not know rather than obscuring the gap with confident language. He found, as Dr. Asante had found before him, that these qualities were not rare but they were unevenly distributed among the people who applied, and that finding them required actually looking rather than assuming their presence on the basis of where someone had studied or worked. He also made mistakes. This is worth saying clearly because the story of a successful professional who built something over 8 years without making mistakes is not a story. It is a myth, and myths are not useful. He hired one person in the first year who turned out to be wrong for the role in ways that had not been apparent in the interview, and that cost him 4 months of disruption to correct. He took a client in the second year who turned out to have expectations that were incompatible with the quality of work Kofi's practice was committed to delivering, and he spent 6 months managing that relationship before concluding that no amount of management would make it work and ending it. He made an analytical error in a client presentation in the third year, a real error, one that affected the recommendation, one that he identified before the client did and disclosed before they discovered it, and that cost him a sleepless month and a letter of remediation and a client who was, in the end, more impressed by the disclosure than damaged by the error. He absorbed each of these things. He extracted what was useful from each of them. He corrected course without self-pity and continued. This is not a quality that receives much attention in professional narratives, the capacity to be wrong without being broken by it, to fail in a specific and bounded way, and to respond to the failure with the same patient precision you bring to everything else. It is perhaps the most important quality a professional can have, and it is entirely impossible to develop without actually failing at things. By the 4th year, the practice had a reputation. Not a loud one. Kofi was not a person who cultivated loudness, but solid. The kind of reputation that people in a specific field develop when the quality of their work reaches a level that the people who are paying closest attention, the ones who are serious about the subject, who know the difference between good and exceptional, who have been disappointed enough times by firms that looked impressive and delivered ordinary, begin to trust and to refer. By the end of the 4th year at Meridian, Kofi was offered a partnership. He accepted. He had been expecting it, and he had done the work to deserve it, and he received it without performance but with genuine satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of someone who has been building something and has arrived at the point where the building is large enough to be confirmed. By the 6th year, he was the managing partner of Meridian Capital. Dr. Asante had planned this transition for 4 years. She was not leaving. She moved into a chairperson role that she had designed specifically to free her from the operational management of the firm while keeping her connected to its strategic direction and its culture. She had identified Kofi as the person who would lead the firm she had built, not because he was the most senior or the longest serving, but because she had watched him for 6 years build something from nothing within the firm, and she understood that the person who could build inside an institution was the person who could sustain and grow the institution itself. She told him 3 months before the formal announcement. She said, "I have spent 6 years watching you. I know what you are. I know what you do with a room when you are given one. I need someone who will protect what Meridian is and grow what Meridian can become. I believe that is you. He said, Why are you telling me 3 months early? She said, Because I want you to have time to think about what you are going to do with it. Not to perform the role, to actually think about what you want to build. You have always been better when you have had time to think. She was right. He was 34 years old when he became managing partner of Meridian Capital. And Meridian Capital, in the 6th year of Kofi's tenure as a partner, had been in quiet and extended discussions about acquiring Hartfield and Associates. The acquisition had been in preparation for longer than most people at either firm understood. Hartfield had been struggling for 4 years by the time the conversations became formal. The industry had changed in ways that firms built on reputation and relationship rather than on genuine analytical capability tended to find difficult. The clients who had come to Hartfield for 40 years because it was the kind of firm you came to if you were the kind of person who came to this kind of firm, because it was established, because it was marble and dark wood, because it occupied the upper 4 floors of a building in the commercial district and had Douglas Osei's name on the door, were beginning to ask questions that Hartfield was struggling to answer. The world wanted specificity and the world wanted depth and the world wanted to know, in language that was not vague, exactly what the quality of the thinking was that it was paying for. Hartfield had never needed to answer these questions precisely. Now it did. Douglas Osei's management had not helped. He was not unintelligent. No one who had spent 22 years at the center of a serious financial institution could be entirely unintelligent. But he had made, over the course of the preceding 4 years, a series of decisions that reflected the specific blindness of his particular kind of success. The blindness of a person who has navigated a world successfully for so long by reading its surface signals correctly that he has stopped being able to distinguish the surface from the substance. He had continued to hire for credential and to promote for relationship management at exactly the moment when the market was demanding capacity and performance. He had continued to invest in the appearance of the institution, the refurbishment of the reception area, the events, the profile building, at the expense of the operational quality that the appearance was supposed to represent. He had made the mistake, which is a common one, of confusing what had worked for 20 years with what would continue to work. By the time the conversations with Meridian began, Hartfield needed a solution. The solution was a firm with the capital, the operational capacity, and the strategic vision to restructure what Hartfield had and build it into something that could survive the next 20 years rather than decline through the next 5. Meridian had all 3. Kofi had not sought this acquisition because of what had happened in that reception area 8 years earlier. He had sought it because it was the right strategic move. Because Hartfield had a client base and a set of institutional relationships that were genuinely valuable, even if the firm had failed to translate them into a practice capable of serving those clients at the level the market now demanded. Because the combined firm would have capabilities that neither had separately. Because the numbers made sense and the strategic logic was sound, and it was exactly the kind of move that the firm he was managing should be making at this stage of its development. All of this was true, and he was also aware when the paperwork was signed of something else. He was aware that he was now the managing partner of the firm that owned Hartfield and Associates. That the people who worked at Hartfield, including the people who had been in that room on that Tuesday morning in January 8 years ago, were now employed by the organization he led. That the letters that authorized their compensation were signed by his hand. He did not perform this awareness. He did not share it. He simply sat with it for a while after the signing was complete, in the quiet of his office with the signed documents before him. He thought about the coffee shop around the corner, the cup of tea, the notebook open to a clean page, the sentence at the top of the page. Then he closed the folder. Then he went back to work. The silence came first. On his first visit to the Hartfield offices as the representative of Meridian, introduced to the assembled staff on the ground floor as the managing partner who would be overseeing the integration, Kofi walked through the marble reception area and onto the floor he had walked onto 8 years earlier. He walked across the same tiles. He passed the same dark wood panels. He looked at the same sliver of light from the same partially open door near the reception desk. Pearl was still there. She was older, 8 years older, and more senior, having been promoted to office manager at some point in the intervening years. She looked at him with the professional composure of someone who is doing her job and is very good at doing her job, and who is simultaneously registering something unexpected without allowing the registering to disrupt the doing of the job. He nodded at her. He said, "Pearl, good to see you again." She said after a moment, "And you, Mr. Mensah." He moved on. He met with the department heads. He reviewed the operational structure with the specificity of someone who understood the business and had already identified what needed to change and was now confirming that his analysis was correct. He asked questions that were precise and answered them honestly when the answers were that something was not working and would need to be addressed. He was direct without being harsh. He was thorough without being overwhelming. He gave people the particular experience of being seen by someone who understood what they were looking at, which is one of the more valuable things a leader can give to the people who work for them, and which was in relatively short supply at an institution that had spent years managing impressions rather than developing capability. He did not mention the Tuesday morning in January. He did not mention Douglas Osei by name. He did not give any indication, in any meeting or in any corridor conversation, that this building had any significance to him beyond its operational relevance. He simply worked. Douglas Osei had left Hartfield 3 months before the acquisition was completed, a mutual separation, negotiated quietly, the kind of exit that institutions and their departing leaders arrange when the leader's tenure has produced outcomes that make continuity untenable and both parties have sufficient professionalism to conclude the relationship without public drama. He was not in the building when Kofi visited. He had not, as far as Kofi knew, made any public statement about the acquisition or about Meridian or about Kofi Mensah. The institution he had mismanaged remained. The people who worked in it remained. The culture he had built, with its preference for surface signals over genuine capacity, its tendency to mistake the credential for the ability, remained, though it was in the process of being addressed. Kofi's work was with all of these things. With the institution and the people and the culture. Not with Douglas Osei himself, who was no longer present and was therefore not available to be worked with. The silence lasted 4 months. It was not calculated. It was not strategic in the way that a planned silence is strategic. It was simply what the work required. Integration is complex and absorbing, and it does not leave space for anything that is not directly relevant to making it work. Kofi gave the integration his full attention because the integration deserved his full attention and because the people at Hartfield, who had not chosen to be acquired, who were managing considerable uncertainty about their own positions and futures, deserved to have someone in charge of the process who was genuinely present in it rather than distracted by personal history. But he was paying attention to the people, to who was good and who was managing the appearance of being good, to who was honest about the firm's problems and who was still protecting the institutional narrative that had obscured them, to who had the capacity to build something new and who could only function within the structure that had been built for them. He was always paying attention. The staff meeting came in the 4th month of the integration. It was a Thursday. The conference room on the 3rd floor of the Hartfield building, which Kofi had booked for the purpose, which held the full assembled staff of the former Hartfield operation, which was the same floor that contained the office or conference room from which the laughter had come 8 years earlier, was full. 47 people, seated in the rows of chairs that had been set out, looking at the man who had come to tell them what came next. Kofi stood at the front of the room. He was 35 years old. He was well-dressed, not in the manner of Douglas Osei, not the clothing of a man cultivating an impression, but the clothing of someone who had earned the right to be in a room and wore what was appropriate without making the clothing a performance. He had notes, but he did not refer to them. He had the particular ease of someone who knows what they are going to say because they have thought about it carefully rather than because they have rehearsed it. He spoke about what the integration had accomplished in its first 4 months and what remained to be done. He was honest about both, more specifically honest about what remained than most people in his position would have been, because he had found that the most effective way to reduce the anxiety of people in a period of institutional uncertainty was to give them accurate information, and that the most damaging thing you could do was to give them reassurances that were imprecise. He talked about the practice areas that would be maintained, the ones that would be restructured, and the ones that would be wound down, clearly without softening it to the point of obscuring the meaning. He talked about what Meridian was, not as an institutional description but as a set of values and a way of working, what it meant to hire for capacity, to promote for performance, to deliver work that was worth the client's money rather than work that looked like it was worth the client's money. He talked about this with the specificity of someone who had lived inside this model for 7 years and had personal experience of what it produced. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He took notes. And then, near the end of the meeting, when the agenda had been mostly covered and the room had moved from the formal attention of people receiving information to the slightly more relaxed attention of people who believe the formal part is concluding, Abina Darko raised her hand. Abina was 43 years old and had been at Hartfield for 11 years. She was a senior analyst in the corporate advisory practice, one of the people Kofi had identified in his first visit as someone who understood the business from the inside and had continued to do good work despite a cultural environment that had not always recognized or rewarded it. She was not someone who spoke in meetings unnecessarily. The fact that she was raising her hand in this meeting at this moment told Kofi something. She said, "Mr. Mensah, I want to ask you something and I want to ask it directly." He said, "Please." She said, "Did you apply to Hartfield once?" 8 years ago. The room became very still. The particular stillness of 47 people simultaneously registering that something significant is happening and waiting to understand what it is. Kofi looked at her for a moment. He said, "Yes, I did." She said, "I thought so. I was the one who processed the applications that year. I was junior then, it was part of my role. I remembered your name when I heard it in connection with the acquisition. I have been thinking about whether to ask you this since your first visit." Kofi said nothing. He waited. She said, "I am glad you are here. I am glad it was you." He looked at her for a long moment, not performing the look, not making it larger than it needed to be, just receiving what she had said with the full attention it deserved. He said, "So am I?" A pause that lasted several seconds. Then he said, "Is there anything else before we close?" There was one more question, about the timing of performance reviews under the new structure. He answered it specifically. He thanked the room. He closed the meeting. He walked out of the conference room on the 3rd floor of the Hartfield building and back to the desk that had been set aside for his use during the integration period, and he sat down and he opened his laptop and he returned to the work that was waiting for him. Now I want to stop here for a moment, because if you have made it this far into Kofi's story, it means something in it has found you. Maybe it is the reception area and the laughter and the specific quality of being dismissed by someone who did not have the capacity to understand what they were dismissing. Maybe it is the coffee shop and the notebook and the sentence at the top of the page. Maybe it is the 8 years of patient, unglamorous, specific, real work that turned the sentence into a firm that eventually owned the building. Leave me a comment right now. Tell me where you are. Are you in the laughter? Are you in the coffee shop? Are you in the years? I read every comment and I respond to as many as I can. Like this video. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because what happens next is the most complete part of the reckoning. The private reckoning came 6 weeks after the staff meeting. Came on a Saturday morning. Kofi was at his desk at home. The desk in the study of the flat he had lived in for 4 years, simply furnished, the kind of space that communicates that the person who uses it is interested in the work that happens there rather than in the impression that the space creates. He was working through a document that needed his attention before Monday. The morning light was good. He had made coffee. He was in the particular productive state that arrives on Saturday mornings when you have chosen to work rather than been required to, when the absence of the week's interruptions allows a sustained attention that is its own kind of pleasure. His phone showed an unfamiliar number. He looked at it. He did not recognize it. He answered anyway. A voice he had not heard in 8 years said, "Kofi, this is Douglas Osei. Thank you for taking the call." Kofi said, "Of course." He set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair. He waited. Osei's voice was different from the voice Kofi remembered from the reception area. That voice had been the voice of a man at the center of his world. Smooth, considered, operating from a position of such assumed authority that it did not need to declare itself. This voice was quieter, more careful. It had the particular quality of someone who has been sitting with a decision for a long time and has finally made it and is now speaking from inside the making of it rather than from the comfortable distance of not having made it yet. He said, "I obtained your mobile number through a colleague. I hope that is acceptable." Kofi said, "It is." He said, "I want to speak to you about what happened the morning you came to Hartfield. I have been aware, since the acquisition was announced, that this conversation was one I should have. And I have been slow about having it, which is its own kind of answer to the question of what kind of man I am. But I want to have it now." Kofi said nothing. He let the silence sit. Jose said, "What we did that morning was wrong. How I spoke about your application before you arrived. How you were treated when you came in. You hurt us. I know that. I understood it in the moment from the way you looked at me when I came out, and it has stayed with me in the way that things stay with you when you know you have done something that cannot be undone. I am not proud of it. I understood it differently then than I understand it now. What I understood then was that we were making a reasonable professional assessment. What I understand now is that we were doing something smaller than that and meaner than that, and that the reasonable professional assessment was a story I was telling myself about behavior that did not deserve a story that flattering." He said all of this without the smoothness of a prepared statement. There was a roughness to it, the particular roughness of someone saying something true that they have been carrying for a long time and are now, for the first time, setting down out loud in a room with another person. Kofi let the silence extend. Not unkindly, simply giving it the space it had earned. Then he said, "Douglas, I am going to tell you something honestly. What happened that morning cost me nothing that I did not recover from. I walked out of your building and I went to the coffee shop around the corner and I wrote a sentence in a notebook. That sentence became the strategy for the next 8 years. What I built, which now includes what you built, is the result of that sentence. The arithmetic of that I do not need you to acknowledge." He paused. He said, "But I hear what you are saying and I receive it in the spirit in which it is offered. And I will tell you this, and I mean it, it is not a performance of magnanimity, it is simply true. The reason I built what I built is not because of that morning. It is despite it. There is a real difference between those two things. The morning did not make me. The morning was a reminder that I needed to make myself. And I went and did that. And what I made eventually included what you made. Not as revenge, as the natural consequence of doing the work correctly for long enough." Jose was quiet for a moment. He said, "I understand the distinction." Kofi said, "Good. And Douglas, I want to say this too. You had 22 years at Hartfield. You built things in that institution that were worth building. The fact that the institution could not survive the changes in the industry is not entirely a story about your decisions. Some of it is a story about how difficult it is to change an institution that has operated the same way for 40 years. I am aware of that difficulty. I am living inside it now. I do not wish you a future of only sitting with the cost of what you got wrong." A pause. He said, "I hope you build something. Whatever comes next. I hope you build it from the things you know rather than the things you assumed." Jose said, "That is generous." Kofi said, "It is honest. There is a difference there too." He ended the call. He sat in the quiet of his study for a while, the phone on the desk before him, the morning light still good, the coffee grown slightly cold. He thought about what had just been said. He thought about the reception area 8 years ago and the coffee shop around the corner and the sentence at the top of the page. He thought about Dr. Asante and Abina and Pearl and the 47 people in the conference room on the 3rd floor. He thought about his father, Emmanuel, who had worked for 31 years as an administrator in a government ministry without ever being given a room large enough for what he was capable of, who had understood this about himself and had not been broken by it, who had simply directed what he had into his children, into Kofi and his siblings, into the consistent and patient transmission of the belief that the work is the point and the quality of the work is what lasts. He thought, "I should call him." He picked up the phone. He called his father. Emmanuel Mensah answered on the 3rd ring, with the alert warmth of a man who is always pleased to hear from his children and never quite gets used to the fact that they call. Kofi said, "Daddy, I want to tell you something." His father said, "Tell me." Kofi told him, not everything, not the full 8 years in detail, but the shape of it. The coffee shop, the sentence, what had been built, the call that had just ended, what he was thinking about now. His father listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Kofi, do you remember what I used to say to you? When you were young and something difficult had happened." Kofi said, "Which thing?" His father said, "I used to say the room does not decide who you are. You decide who you are. The room only decides who it lets in today." Kofi was quiet for a moment. He said, "I remember." His father said, "You decided correctly. I have always known you would." They talked for another 20 minutes about other things, about his father's health, about his mother, about his siblings and their lives. The ordinary conversation of a family that has maintained itself across time and distance and difficulty. When he ended the call, he sat in the quiet of his study for a little while longer. Then he picked up his pen. He went back to the document that needed his attention before Monday. There was still work to do. So here is what I want to leave with you. Kofi's story is not a revenge story. I need you to hear this clearly because this kind of story is sometimes mistaken for revenge, and it is not that. He did not build Meridian Capital in order to acquire Hartfield. He built it because it was the right firm to build, because the work was meaningful and real and the clients they served needed what the practice provided. The acquisition of Hartfield was a strategic decision made by a company that had outgrown its competitors. The fact that one of those competitors was the firm that had once laughed at his application was not the plan. It was the consequence, the natural consequence of doing the work correctly for long enough in an industry that is not, in the end, very large. What Kofi built, he built for reasons that had nothing to do with Douglas Osei. But the sentence Osei said, "Does he know what kind of place this is?" That sentence he carried, not as a wound, not as the thing that drove him, the fuel in the engine. Wounds are not fuel. People who build on wounds build things that have the wound's shape rather than the work's shape, and those things tend to crack where the wound was. He carried it as a question, a specific and useful question that required a specific and useful answer. Does he know what kind of place this is? He knows now. He knows because he built a place of his own and then walked into theirs with the authority that building your own place gives you. He knows because Abina Darko, who processed his application 8 years ago, looked at him across a conference room and said, "I am glad you are here," with the specific gladness of someone who is witnessing the right thing happening. He knows because his father answered on the third ring and said, "The room does not decide who you are. The room does not decide who you are. The room only decides who it lets in today. And today is not permanent. Today is just today. The interview that goes wrong, the application that is laughed at, the door that does not open, these things happen on a Tuesday. The rest of the week continues. The rest of the year continues. The years continue. And in the years, if you go to the coffee shop around the corner and open your notebook and write the right sentence at the top of the page and then spend however long it takes making that sentence true, the rooms open. They always open. You do not need the room to know what you are. You do not need the laughter to stop before you begin. You do not need Douglas Osei to call on a Saturday morning and tell you that he understands now what he did not understand then. Though if he calls, you answer and you tell him the truth because that is the kind of person you are building yourself to be. You need a notebook. You need a sentence. You need the willingness to work specifically and patiently and without performance, for as long as it takes. God does not waste what you have been through. Not the laughter. Not the marble reception area. Not the 11 minutes of waiting. Not the pleasantness of a man who did not need to be unkind because he did not think you mattered enough to warrant unkindness. All of it becomes material. Build something they will need to buy, and then go and build it. If Kofi's story found you today, if something in it sat in a way that felt like recognition, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are. Tell me what sentence you have written at the top of your page. Tell me what you are building. Like this video, if it moved something in you. Share it with someone who has been laughed out of a room and needs to be reminded that the conversation is not finished. Subscribe to African Tales by Charlie. New stories every day. I will see you in the next one.